Good afternoon to all of you and welcome to our panel discussion on the crisis in Ukraine. My name is Jennifer Welsh. I'm a professor in global governance and security at McGill University and the director of our Center for International Peace and Security Studies at McGill. I want to just begin as we begin our sessions at Max Bell by acknowledging that we are situated on the traditional territory of the Ganakahage, which has long served as a site of meeting and exchange among Indigenous peoples, including the Haudenosaunee and the Anishinaabe nations. And we acknowledge and thank the diverse Indigenous peoples whose presence marks this territory on which peoples of the world now gather. The Max Bell School acknowledges the ways in which public policy has contributed to or failed to address systemic oppression. And we aim to develop in solidarity with Indigenous peoples research and a curriculum that emphasizes the importance of representation and equitable public policy. We are gathered this late afternoon and early this evening in a very fast moving environment. And I want to just summarize for you some of the dizzying events that have occurred in the past week following the launch announced on state television by President Putin of Russia's, in inverted commas, special military operation in Ukraine. We have seen solidarity expressed by NATO allies in terms of providing military assistance. We have seen a historic decision by Germany to provide military equipment and also to announce the increase in its defense spending by up to 2% of GNP, long a hoped for contribution by the United States to NATO funding. We have also seen the European Union show unity among 27 countries that has been quite remarkable, not only putting in place unprecedented financial sanctions, but also agreeing to purchase and deliver military equipment to Ukraine. A quite striking development for what began as an economic bloc. And then finally, we saw yesterday in the UN General Assembly, 141 countries, including longstanding allies of Russia, including Serbia, Bolsonaro's Brazil, as an example of a resolution that condemned in the strongest possible terms Russian aggression. And the General Assembly used the word aggression to call for the immediate withdrawal of Russian troops into Ukrainian territory, pre-invasion territory, and to effectively reverse Russia's recognition of the independence of Donetsk and Luhansk regions. Also, the General Assembly strongly condemned the Russian president's decision to increase the readiness levels of Russia's nuclear forces. We have a heartbreaking and tragic situation on the ground in Ukraine itself, with the southern strategic city of Kherson coming under Russian control, and an increasingly dire situation for those civilians who remain. But over 1 million Ukrainians are also now on the move, 500,000 of them going into Poland. So it's a remarkable moment, and we are here to discuss it with a fantastic panel. I just want to let everyone know that we have closed captioning services available on this broadcast. So live transcription is available. You can click the CC button at the bottom of your screen. And we are also going to have an opportunity for question and answer. So you can place your questions in the chat function. I'm so glad we can come together as a community at Max Bell and at SIPS to discuss what is one of the most momentous events we've seen in international politics for a long time. I firmly believe this is what universities are for. And we have an opportunity tonight. We have a terrific panel of speakers, and I want to thank them in advance for making themselves available to speak to us tonight. They're going to speak for about 10 to 12 minutes each, and then we will open up to question and answer. And I'll go in the order in which I'm going to ask them to talk. So our first speaker is my colleague from the Political Science Department at McGill, Professor Timofiy, who's an Indian political scientist and the James McGill Professor of International Relations at McGill. He specializes in international security, regional security, and South Asia, but has also been writing prolifically on issues of status and rising powers in global politics. And he served as the president of the International Studies Association and the founding director of SIPS. Next, as our speaker, we have Dr. Timofiy Mylovanov, who is the president of the Kiev School of Economics. And he has also been elected to the board of the National Bank of Ukraine and held the position of deputy chairman of the board. He was also, from August 2019 to March 2020, the Minister of Economic Development, Trade and Agriculture of Ukraine. He graduated from Kiev's Polytechnic Institute, majoring in economics, and he has founded a platform called Vox Ukraine, aimed to increase the level of economic discussion in Ukraine. And finally, we have Kerry Buck, who was until recently Assistant Secretary, Economic Sector at the Treasury Board of Canada. But for the purposes of this discussion today, her appointment as Canada's ambassador to NATO during some tumultuous times that dealt also with Russia and Central and Eastern Europe. She's had many positions within Global Affairs Canada, political director and assistant deputy minister for international security and political affairs, head of the Afghanistan Task Force, Director General for the Middle East and Maghreb. And outside of our Department of Foreign Affairs, or GAC as it is now known, Kerry has also served in the Privy Council Office as Director of Operations for Machinery of Government. But she holds degrees not only from McGill, which I'm pleased to say, but also from the University of Western Ontario. So let me turn first to Timofiy for his opening remarks. And I asked TV to talk a little bit about trying to decipher Russia's objectives, what these early days are telling us about Russia's capability, but also about how the great powers themselves are interacting at this very heightened moment of tension. So over to you, TV.
Thank you, Jennifer, and the Bell Center, Bell Public Policy School graduate students to organize this very critical discussion, and this forum is very good. I want to salute Dr. Mylovanov. You're coming from Ukraine to us, and it is really an honor to see you and hear your views, and Ambassador Black, as well as others on this podium. Now, my insights are based on the subject of security studies. I've been teaching and doing research, and quite a few of these things are popping up, and some are my observations based on my research on the historical instances of wars and what is going on here to that extent. I see two critical norms are contesting. One is the idea of great powers, before that imperial powers, their idea of spheres of influence. In other words, they need a particular area under their control, especially their near abroad as well as the immediate neighborhood, for their status power as well as security objectives. And they have gone to extraordinary length of warfare, Russia in particular, in its imperial history, doing that, of course, through expansion. The non-great power states, especially smaller states, they want to free from this yoke of great power clutches. Sphere of influence is something they don't like because it is totally against the norm that they hold, that you call self-determination, sovereign equality, territorial integrity. All this means the last 100 years of struggle to get where we are today. It was a struggle for releasing the great powers or accepting, or forcing them to accept this idea of sovereign equality, self-determination, as well as territorial integrity. And this evolution of these two norms have clashed often. Great powers try their best to stop it, but obviously during post-war settlements, these were accepted. And that's one of the settlement, that is 1991 settlement, that we are witnessing the unfinished business of that settlement. And so what Ukraine is doing is extraordinary struggle to protect that norm for the rest of the world. So one has to appreciate that this is not just a Ukrainian struggle. But the problem is the great power in this context is known for extraordinary use of force and an unwillingness to concede. Of course, it did during the end of the Cold War, but under a considerable amount of weakness. And so here the weaker actor can fight. Of course, it has, as far as we see, strong resolve, strong leadership, and some supply of materials, but that supply is very critical here, and I'll go into that in a minute. And the popular support to take pains. And obviously the Ukrainian people, I must say that at least looking from outside, are showing that staying power. We need to know, I mean, we don't know how long they can stay into this context, but clearly they can fight some more years if things go to that extent. But here some good news and bad news: the strong need not win all the time. Twice in Afghanistan, the United States recently, and before that, the Soviet Union had to withdraw, and Vietnam, and many other contexts, the strong need not always win. But the winner can also be a loser in many ways. But here the point is, this is going to cause extraordinary suffering for the innocent Ukrainians, and of course, some people who live in that neighborhood. Ukrainian situation is that they have certain amount of support from NATO, but not sufficient enough to deter, to prevent the Russians from invading and doing the things they're doing right now to their cities and their civilian population. One other thing I want to say is the learning tendencies of great powers, extraordinarily dysfunctional, the great power understanding of things. When you talk about great power, there's a very small group of people making decisions on these areas. They also are short term. Of course, they're thinking in long term, but what they are thinking often is we have this immediate capacity to assert our position. If we wait too long, we may lose that. And this is a problem I will come in, the problem of time pressure. Now, the learning is dysfunctional because it usually lasts for a generation. Vietnam, US learned for some 20, 30 years not to send troops into the theater. They developed all kinds of precision-guided munitions. But then in Iraq, they violate that commitment they made themselves. Soviet Union, Russia, the same thing, intervened in Afghanistan. Now they are breaking that notion of non-interference by sending troops in. So this learning is because the problem is they don't have good exit strategies. They're very weak in their exit strategies. They act very tough because they have enough firepower to engage in massive use of force, as US did in Iraq and Afghanistan. and now Russia in Ukraine. Now, the question is, why couldn't the West in particular, NATO in particular, could not deter this invasion or this aggressive behavior? The two kinds of deterrence here both failed. One is called deterrence by denial, or denying victory or potential calculation of this aggressor. The other is deterrence by punishment, and both require capability, credibility, and communication. In other words, you have to have the capacity to deter, you have to have the credible capacity, and the opponent should believe you. And time horizon matters too. Putin appears to be feeling that in the long run, his country really will decline if he doesn't stop this spread of NATO. His country means a civilizational country. Ukraine is very critical for stopping NATO expansion or Western expansion, and Western nuclear capabilities are improving. Conventional capabilities are limited in the Baltic states and some of the other states joined, but that could change in the long run. So he has developed, actually last 10 years, they have developed extraordinary military capacity, hybrid warfare. They have hypersonic missiles. They have a very interesting cross-domain concept of cross-domain coercion, blending threat with cyber and propaganda. And NATO is also developing, but they have definitely got some advantages right now going for in what he called the hybrid warfare area. So he realizes that this democracy promotion that NATO is encouraging will entail Russia losing its position. The Russia that he envisions, which is kind of civilizational, going back to Peter the Great and Catherine the Great. Some of it is propaganda, but clearly he has calculations based on those historical understanding of what Russia is. Now, he is also noticing a short-term US weakness. The Afghanistan pullout really must have encouraged him. This is a very weak superpower. And the divided Democratic Republican divide in the United States, and his ability to penetrate the social media to some extent. And so he's facing this time pressure. You go in now when you have the capacity to change the status quo rather than wait too long when the West is weak in his point of view. And so he is not driven purely by the so-called economic rationality. This is where the people who think sanctions will work are somewhat mistaken. If that is the case, many wars in human history would not have happened, because he is willing to take certain amount of pain. And he is also driven by what you call value rationality in basically trying to look at his culture, civilizational ideas for protecting his country. And so he wants to bring back the state, at least partially, the lost territories, a redundant idea to some extent. And we know that the short-term tendencies of calculations matter in historical instances. Japan in 1939, 40, we have 1.5 years of oil left to take on the US. If we don't do that now, we will not win in the future. So short war, but here the calculation is slightly different, that he has a force in being, and he has shown that in Syria, in Georgia, in Chechnya, that he is able to achieve his goals through the use of force. Of course, this is a much more magnified use of force. Now, what are the implications? I think we need to look at the immediate implications. Of course, the fear of escalation. Actually, I am a little fearful. I'm afraid that this will not be easily solved. Part of it is there is going to be supply coming from Poland and other neighboring places, and he will have to cut down those supply lines. And that would mean entering NATO territory to some extent, even if it's not a direct intervention. And so this may be like Afghanistan to some extent, where Pakistan acted as a conduit. But it is different in the sense Pakistan was a very strong supporter and there was Mujahideen working behind. We don't know what kind of support that Ukrainians will get. And the other problem is, if he is extremely concerned about changing the status quo, he has to do something about Moldova, he may go in at least to challenge the Baltic states, because those are actually showing the place where, if he can show NATO is powerless in defending, of course, high risk taker behavior that would be, but I'm not totally ruling that out if the war escalates and NATO is not willing to negotiate with him for what he wants, or Ukraine too. So now what about China? I mean, this is where the other worry, whether China will take the lead. My sense is China may take a bit longer because they have to lose a lot more economically, and they are a lot more economic calculation. Their economic calculation is much deeper. But there is a historical parallel here too. Japan joins the war after Germany started winning, and Italy, fascist Italy joining Germany in a bandwagoning situation. So there is a lot of this bandwagoning effect can happen if this thing goes on, and if Putin wins. This is another big question mark here. And so the other issue is, what's the role of nuclear weapons? We all thought nuclear weapons disappeared from the scene. And Russia has modified its doctrine. It is kind of, it used to be a no first use. NATO has a first use doctrine, but now it is more possible first use. And they have improved their capabilities, while the United States is also improving their capabilities. So we are entering a new phase in nuclear arms race, including cyber, including other forms of warfare. Now, this is not 1914, luckily, because intelligence information is good. And nuclear weapons are doing two functions here. One, it is preventing spread of war in a big way, different from 1914. The second is it's encouraging, it is giving the capacity to Russia to do what it is doing. So in a way, it's sort of a stability instability paradox that strategists talk about in the past. He's not fearing retaliation. That's why he can do certain things to Ukraine. More militarized international order. Unfortunately, that is likely to happen. We are actually in a situation, this is unlikely for either side to give up easily if Ukraine can continue this struggle. And incentives are very low, as our esteemed guest here, we were chatting about it, because it's their existential issue here. If you don't fight, you will not stay as a nation state. When countries or people feel that they need to fight, this was what the Vietnamese felt, the Afghans felt, they will fight. The question is under what conditions the other side will use massive force, which I think they're already starting to use, siege warfare in particular. And so Russia wants to overthrow the post-1991 world order, which I think they find an opportunity here. They may achieve some of it, but we are going to see an increased round of international tensions and international security, especially nuclear security issues, becoming very important in our daily discourse, something that we are not used to for the past 20 years or so. This is a big transition point, and I hope and pray that the Ukrainian people will not suffer more than what they are experiencing now. Thank you.
Thank you so much, TV. And I'm going to turn directly to Timofiy. We asked him to try to share with us his sense of where the pockets of strength in the Ukrainian resistance are, to give us his up-to-date analysis of how this crisis is unfolding. But we also want to thank you for joining us in what must be an incredibly difficult time for you personally, for your family, and for many who you know. We're very much looking forward to your remarks. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I appreciate the opportunity to be able to speak to you. And, you know, I was in the US last week, I guess, or maybe a little bit more now, just several days before the invasion. And I felt that it's not gonna be any more safe in Ukraine, so I had to come back to Ukraine, to Kyiv, to lead the Kyiv School of Economics through potentially difficult times. But I also work at the University of Pittsburgh, so I'm a game theorist by training, and I study strategy of conflict. I wanted to make a couple of remarks which I kind of learned or impressed me quite a bit over the discussions and coverage of the Russian-Russian war or Russian-Ukrainian war over the last week. So one, I think I kind of, I now call it Russian-splaining, as if in mansplaining. It is when everyone looks at the conflict from the perspective of what Putin thinks or what Putin can do, and kind of taking Ukraine out of the picture completely, or objectifying it. And I'll give an example. Even today, we are basically asking the question, what are the early days telling us about the capacity of Russia? What have we learned? And the question we pose about Ukraine is, what are the pockets of strength? And we're not asking what have we learned about the capacity of Ukraine. And, somehow there's an assumption that there is this great power, Russia, and it's through 100,000, 150,000 troops, and it cannot take Kyiv, and it is bombing it, and it is, encircling it, and it's killing civilians. And, we're thinking that, maybe, this is going to be between the great powers to work it out, and what's the deterrent strategy and sanctions and such. And, having an implicit assumption here that the only way to stop Russia is, if the West does something, the great powers. But fundamentally, I think this is the paradox, because it's Ukraine which is stopping Russia, and West has failed at stopping Russia. And we're still not taking Ukraine, or not studying Ukraine, not trying to understand Ukraine. And we're constantly being surprised by Ukraine. So I'll give you two more examples of why we're getting surprised by Ukraine. We still have air defense and air force operational, and every report we've heard before the invasion was that, listen, there's no air force is weak, it will be suppressed in the first day, and that would be it. And here's another example. I was at the University of Toronto, Northwestern, Harvard discussion a couple of days ago, and there's a cybersecurity expert, and he's just discussing that he's very surprised that Russia has not been able to shut down our Ukrainian banking system and telecom systems because they have such a great cyber capacity. And there's again no discussion about the cyber capacity of Ukraine, and there's just an assumption that Ukraine is a victim. Today, Ukraine counterattacked on a number of directions. I'm not trying to be naive about the price, and I'm not trying to be naive about how much stronger and more powerful and superior is Russian military. But in the village in which I'm staying today, I was at the drafting headquarters, military drafting headquarters, and every 15 minutes or every 10 minutes, there would be a bus full of people going to the, drafted people, enlisted people going to the front line. So it looks like in my village, there will be no males left. Everyone will be in the military. I have a vice president of the Kyiv School of Economics, actually two, who joined military. And one of them is the director of the CEO, director of a think tank, or fact-checking think tank, working with Facebook on fact-checking in Eastern and Central Europe, and competing with some French fact-checking services. He's now holding a Kalashnikov and has been in five or six firefights over the last 2 or 3 days. And, I'm not sure they have, we probably have mobilized, I don't know, 500,000 people by now. But I don't know what the numbers are, because these numbers are not official. It looks like Ukraine is just regrouping and mobilizing, really mobilizing. So I think the paradox here is that if Russia is to be stopped, if Putin is to be stopped, it's going to be done by Ukrainians. And the Western policies, unfortunately, have failed to do any meaningful stopping or deterrence for Russia. So I think that's one angle I want to mention. I think the West or the EU, the NATO, they were afraid of engaging Russia. And my second point would be that people who think that NATO is not going to be engaged are in self-denial. NATO is engaged now. Ukraine invasion is just one of the many episodes. There was 2014 annexation of Crimea. There was 2008 annexation of parts of Georgia. Then there is Belarus. There is Kazakhstan, where Russia simply put boots on the ground to suppress protests. In case of Belarus, they are having at least 70 missiles were fired from Belarusian territory. So I'm not sure, Belarus has any sovereignty anymore when it comes to global military operations. So my point is that here we see a pattern of escalation from Russia. And this pattern is really taking up not a notch, but a degree every time there is a next episode. So if Ukraine falls now, then there will be a next episode. Or whoever thinks that that Russia will stop at Ukraine, it doesn't have any evidence, empirical evidence to back it up. It's simply a belief that the world cannot be rational. It cannot be rational for Russia to engage NATO, but Russia put thousands of tanks in Ukraine, and I think Germany and Poland, each country has about 200 or 170, 300 tanks. It's not clear how operational they are de facto, and there were more than 200 tanks burned this week alone. And people have to kind of become real about this. NATO, unless the US intervenes, NATO will not have the capacity to deter Russia in conventional warfare. Will Russia engage conventionally with the NATO countries? Well, they're probably not going to declare it, but no one declares wars anymore. We're in a hybrid warfare today. There's always some manufactured pretext where people are demanding some kind of sovereignty and separation and protesting, and then Russians come to defend it. And you have plenty of excuses like that in Latvia and Lithuania and Estonia. So I think either Poland or the Baltic countries are next. So that's my second point, that regardless of the situation, NATO is going to be engaged. And the third one is that it's in the interest of NATO and the EU to impose the no-fly zone over Ukraine now, because you don't have to impose it directly. You can do it covertly, but you have to impose it because the cost of the dynamic conflict and escalation later in 5-10 years will be higher. Thank you.
Timofiy, thank you very much. And I very much appreciate your comments about what lens we should be using to look at these events, and giving us a very real and immediate sense of how mobilized the country is. We see this only through our media, and so to hear you speak about your direct colleagues is really powerful in bringing home that point about mobilization. And it's incredibly impressive and has been very striking for all of us. I want to turn finally to Kerry Buck. I'm very glad she was able to be with us today, as having served as Canada's ambassador to NATO. I asked Kerry to, also think about, the counterfactuals and what happened after the first incursion into Ukraine with Crimea in 2014, but also to share with us her thoughts on how the alliance tried to deter, what its prospects are now, perhaps even if she's willing to consider this issue of the no-fly zone, which has been much discussed. But welcome, and we're very eager to hear your comments.
Well, thank you very much, Jennifer, for inviting me, and thank you so much to the two previous speakers. I'll try and ask, I'll ask 3 questions and give you my answers. Those 3 questions are, how did we get here? It's clear there's been a failure. We've got war in Europe, and I think it's the most dangerous period that we've seen since about 1945. We saw cluster bombs in residential neighborhoods today, refugees pouring out. So I'd like to think about where the failure lies, and that might help us determine what comes next. Question 2, I'd like to look at what this means now for NATO and attempt to answer what next. All this in, I'm going to try and do this in less than 8 minutes, so you have a lot of time for questions and comments. So how did we get here? Is it about the West not reacting with sufficient force to the annexation of Crimea in 2014? I was on the file at the time, and so I'm talking to you from the perspective of a practitioner, right? So what I saw following Russia's annexation of Crimea in 2014 was a very quick and very robust response, more robust than I had expected, given where countries had been prior to Crimea in terms of their relations to Russia. So moved very quickly to suspend Russia from the G7, which was a big, big deal. And it happened quickly. Moved quickly to impose sanctions on Russia. And then inside NATO, where I moved right after that, we managed to secure consensus to have NATO beef up its eastern flank. That took a lot of work inside NATO. That wasn't an immediate decision by NATO allies. They hadn't quite come to the spot of understanding the threat that Russia faced. So if there's a failure in that, it's a failure in that we underestimated Mr. Putin significantly. But knowing where the what the political landscape was before Crimea, I was actually quite surprised and with the robust response that happened in 2014. So inside NATO, it took us quite a while to convince the allies that we needed to beef up the eastern flank. Because what had happened over the period prior is that NATO had built up in the south because it was doing out of area operations. It was focusing on Afghanistan. So it was imbalanced along the eastern flank. So we worked and we got agreement to install the 4 battle groups in the Baltics and secured agreement for Canada to lead those battle groups. So while in hindsight, the response to Crimea in 2014 was insufficient, I wonder if we'd done more at the time, if that would have deterred President Putin. And I'll get into that in a second. Is it about insufficient deterrence with the threatened sanctions? I believe now the sanctions package that was foreshadowed before Christmas, after Christmas, was really robust. And it looks now very clear that President Putin had been planning this for a while, and there was actually not much that would deter him from that path. If you look at the package proposals that Russia put on the table before Christmas, it was ludicrous. There was very little in there that the West could have accepted. And there was one Moscow newspaper that said, well, look, President Putin has asked the West for a live unicorn for Christmas. There was very little in there that could have made an opening for some kind of off-ramp. And I know the negotiators who were doing this, the American and the Russian negotiators who were talking about this in January, those are the people who managed to negotiate the first Iran deal together. I've negotiated with both of them. If there was a deal to be found, they could have reached a deal eventually. I don't think there was a deal to be found at the time. So what we saw prior to Christmas was President Putin driving by all of the off-ramps that were offered to him. So if it wasn't about an insufficient Western response in 2014, and if it wasn't about sanctions because he couldn't have been deterred anyway, why does Ukraine find itself in the worst hot war that we've seen for decades and decades, over 70 years? I think there are three reasons President Putin moved against Ukraine now. And in this, I agree with Dr. Paul. Reason one, democratization. He fears so much color revolution inside Russia. And the worst case scenario for him is a vibrant democracy and a prosperous economy sitting next door in Ukraine, because it is offering a model that he is not delivering to his own people. So when he says that one of the rationales for invading is NATO expansion, that's counterfactual if you go through the historical record. There are numerous times when Russian leaders, including Putin himself, said NATO expansion is for the two countries to decide themselves. So that's misinformation. I think it's about democratization, and I think it's about the success of Ukraine. We don't actually see in Canada, we don't see Ukraine as a victim. We see Ukraine as a vibrant state that has come so far since it got out under the former Soviet Union. So that's reason one. Reason two, I agree with Dr. Paul, perceived weakness of the West. President Trump undercutting NATO and cozying up to Putin weakened the West. Change of leadership in Europe. The reason we got those strong sanctions in 2014, which for the time were strong, was because of Angela Merkel holding the EU together, and the UK was inside the EU. So his calculus was, with the transition of Merkel going out, UK no longer in EU, that there was a weakened Western leadership. And the third reason, I think, is a real change in President Putin's leadership style. He has consolidated control. He's removed many of those checks and balances that he had even earlier in his rule. So a key reason many of us thought Russia was bluffing about a full-on invasion is because we assumed he wasn't making these decisions alone. So even before Crimea, even as late as 2014, when Putin decided to annex Crimea, the move was taken after a night of internal consultations with his inner circle in the Kremlin, and he had commissioned secret polls of public opinion. None of that happened here this time, at least not that we can see. So there was still some semblance of checks and balances on President Putin at the time, but now he's alone. He's become a personalist dictator. Rivals are purged, cults of loyalty are rewarded, cult of personality, and all authority runs through him. And these kinds of dictatorships are more erratic. They're more prone to go to war, and because they surround themselves with yes men, they perform in wars more poorly. So I think that's the state we're at right now. And that leads me back to, it explains my conclusion that, you know, maybe we were naive about the sanctions. You still have to try, but he was never going to take those off-ramps. So what does this mean for NATO? It's good news and it's bad news for NATO. It's really bad news for Ukraine. But on NATO, it perversely, the thing that President Putin wanted the least has come to pass. We have a stronger NATO right now with more solid, unshakable NATO consensus and NATO-EU integration than I ever thought possible. And it's because of what he's done over the last week. NATO defense plans have been activated. EU, as you said, Jennifer, is flowing weapons. Finland and Sweden are part of the conversation and, you know, signaling that they're thinking about membership. Ukraine and the West are winning the information war. I'm not surprised about that. If you think about the tech capacity in Ukraine, Lviv is like a place that we all go and, you know, poach tech engineers, and Kyiv. Yeah, I'm not surprised. I am surprised we're winning the information war right now because President Putin has honed his skills in that front. And the sanctions are global. They go beyond NATO, they go beyond Europe, and even China and even some of its close friends, including China, are starting to distance themselves a bit. So that's the good news for NATO. But the bad news for Ukraine and NATO is that whatever happens in Ukraine will determine the fate of NATO. It just will, in a number of ways. Although NATO's guarantee of its collective defense guarantee doesn't extend to Ukraine, the fact is that NATO's long-term credibility will be damaged if Ukraine falls. It absolutely will. All of Europe and North America will suffer aftershocks on refugees, economics, and security aftershocks if Ukraine falls. If President Putin manages to take substantial parts of Ukraine territory, it makes NATO's job of protecting NATO allies much more difficult, because the irony is Putin has always said that NATO's encircling Russia. Only 6% of Russia's land borders touch NATO now. A lot more will touch NATO, depending how much of Ukraine he seeks to control. So it is not good for NATO. And in the longer term, as I said, it will be those economic shocks, those stability shocks, those security shocks are going to be felt for a long time. Imagine an aggressive Russia coupled with a melting Arctic for us. It turns our job of North American security into a whole different thing. So think about that. It will take years for the consequences of this to play out, and we have a very difficult period coming up that will determine that longer term future. So what's happening right now? The risk of accident will only increase. US and NATO planes are already flying very, very close to Russian planes, and that will increase daily. And the fact is we don't have the deconfliction mechanisms that existed during the Cold War. There will be more troops into the Baltics, Romania, Poland. The risks of accidents will flow and spike. The bigger risk, I think, right now is that NATO weapons flowing into Ukraine will cross that threshold of direct conflict and drag NATO allies in some way, shape, or form into direct conflict with Russia. It's a very difficult thing right now. NATO allies are trying to thread the needle of not crossing that threshold, but the challenge is who decides whether the threshold has been crossed. It's Russia, and it's not us, right? So trying to thread the needle of supplying those weapons to Ukraine without crossing the threshold, it's a very difficult and very, very delicate thing to do right now, but it's in NATO allies' interest, it's in NATO's interest to make sure that sufficiently robust weapons get into Ukraine, because Ukraine is fighting that fight for all of NATO in a way, right? The risk of regional war is really, really high. 2 points and I'll end. On the no-fly zone, the challenge is that a no-fly zone requires not just surveillance, but interception of planes that will cross the no-fly zone. And think about the complexity of some of the rules of engagement that you need to assess, right? So a Russian plane is crossing into a no-fly zone. Do you do hot pursuit? Do you do hot pursuit into Russian territory? Who secures the no-fly zone? I think there's a tactical decision going on right now. You're seeing much more European leadership. That's good. Europe is leading. But I also think it's the US being quite tactical and letting Europe lead, because the risk of President Putin choosing to characterize something as crossing that threshold and leading to direct war between Russia and NATO, that is less, it's less of a visible US presence. So no-fly zones, explicit no-fly zones, I don't think NATO will go there. I don't think so. That's what the US has been signaling, and I think they'll stick with that as long as they could, because the risk, it turns it from a risk of regional and Europe-wide conflict into almost an assurance of regional and Europe-wide conflict. Final point on nuclear. That taboo against the use of tactical nukes in the battlefield is still there. And that's important to preserve that taboo. And how we interpret what the Russians have done is important. And my colleagues, former colleagues who are experts in Russian nuclear thinking, their assessment right now is that he hasn't actually moved into an alert state that would require a response. And the US reaction to it of de-escalating, I think, is a very smart one. So the risk is definitely there. I'm not afraid yet. And I will end on that note.
Thanks very much. And I just wanted to respond in the chat to a comment that it was disappointing to hear me use Putin's language. I'm sorry if I was misinterpreted. I said in inverted commas. This, by no means do I think this was a special operation. I think this was legally what we call an intervention, but colloquially what we call an invasion. But thank you for calling me out on it. I'm happy for us to have a robust discussion, but I just wanted to clarify. Timofiy wanted to come back in. There's also a couple of questions, including one here about nuclear weapons that I'll come back to, but also a question about India and a question about NATO membership. So first, I'm going to just allow Timofiy to have a follow-up question. And then I'm going to put a few of those to the panel that have been put in the chat. Anyone else, please also add your questions into the chat and we'll try to get to them. We have until 5:45. So Timofiy, please.
Thank you. On the explicit no-fly zone, there's no need to do it explicit. And of course, you're correct. Full no-fly zone is probably means there will be an escalation, and that's not smart. Putin has not been declaring war. He has been doing hybrids. So, you know, drones have proved when, and some air defenses have proven very, very effective. So you can be, I think the right approach would be moving towards gradual tightening to de facto a very difficult fly zone operation for Russian Air Force.
Yeah.
And there are multiple ways of implementing it. You know, you can train Ukrainian operators, you can provide equipment, you can do mercenaries, you can do covert operations. You know, that's what Russia has been doing. That's in their playbook. You know, there's no need to announce it, you know, but and maybe some of that's been done actually. Okay, as of now. Then I still want to comment on this Ukraine splaining. I'm sorry, I think we have to fight for it. I think it's really important for everyone. So here's an example of a phrase, and we're surprised that we're winning info war because President Putin has honed his info skills. Let me ask this, do you think Ukraine doesn't put fakes into Russian media space? Do you think we do not target individually through Silicon Valley companies? We don't push, or through crypto. Yeah. We do.
Yeah.
We push, we airdrop through crypto to wallets information.
Ukraine is better at info ops than the West.
Yes, I think that's true. And Zelensky.
When I say we, I meant, I actually wasn't talking about Ukraine. We've learned from you as we've gone into the Baltics, for instance. We've learned from Estonia and others who've, so I agree with you. And I agree with you on no-fly zone. Absolutely.
Yeah, so I'm not challenging, and I'm not trying, I'm just like a little bit maybe direct, but that's my style. People who know me, this is my also style of leadership. It's and Zelensky is like that too, by the way. He is like, you know, he will call in sometimes even too much according to our standards. So, you know, there is a bunch of people like that in Ukraine. But the point, I think, you see, that's the weakness of Putin. He has shut down fact-checking and grassroots media. And right now we have 1,500 foreign journalists in Ukraine right now operating in the war zone, 1,500. So there is coverage, there is facts. And look at what Putin has done. He has shut down any kind of alternative He's shutting down Echo of Moscow, he's shutting down everything. So that creates a vacuum, and it works tactically very well for the couple of days or couple of weeks. But then everyone who is going to be fed some kind of polarizing information, then thinking, maybe it's true. Maybe the government is lying to me. And now the government has lost the ability to have Echo Moskwy or some opposition media say, no. This time it was a info op, or it was Stratcom, or it was psych op. It really has, because they don't have any, it's either Putin, media, or nothing. So if the psyops or psychological operations or strategic communication operations are going to be, succeed at challenging credibility of Putin, then he doesn't have any second line of defense because he has shut down opposition media. And I think that's what Ukrainians are exploiting in a decentralized way. So I think there's structural issues, and he killed his institutions, and that's making him weaker now.
Okay, so let me bring in a couple of audience. Thank you. Let me bring in a couple of audience questions. So there is a question, TV, around the diplomatic stances as well of other key states. So I mentioned yesterday the GA resolution, which had 141 states in support, but some very interesting abstentions on the part of India, Pakistan, and of course China and South Africa. And there are many who are arguing now that there needs to be effort invested in having countries that might have influence with Russia try to play a role. So I wonder if you could say a little bit about, in response to this question, about how you see India's diplomacy in this. And then Kerry, a question for you from earlier in the chat, a question about whether NATO membership itself is enough to deter an attack. I think that's a question that many are asking. And then I'll come back to you, Timofiy, in a second round with a couple of questions that have come in the chat for you. So if I could perhaps bring TV in at this stage, and then Kerry.
I may answer a bit on the nuclear issue too. I think there is an assumption that alliances somehow prevent wars. Alliances can be a cause of war in international relations who study, alliances can be a cause of war. Here, the nuclear factor is what is actually deterring to some extent from direct intervention. But my fear is indirect interventions are possible, and NATO membership is no assurance of indirect interventions and wars of what you have seen in many other parts of the world. The question of India, I think India is in a real soup right now, as far as I read from a distance. They get their most cutting edge weapon from Moscow, their missiles, their aircraft, and the Russians have been ever willing to give them the most sophisticated weapon, which the United States won't. They give the second tier weapons. F-16 is the maximum that the US would go. So something like 60% of the Indian defense equipment is dependent on Moscow. That is, I think, the biggest constraining factor here for the Indian leadership. But I do agree that they need to be more proactive. They cannot have both ways. They have been a defender of sovereignty and sovereign rights of states ever since India was an independent country. They need to be a little bit more proactive with respect to diplomacy, and that they can do, even though it may not come out anything. But the point is, the mediator's role is missing now. They played that in Korea, in situations in the past. But I think Modi is more cautious than previous leaders to some extent. So I don't see a big change going to happen to them unless they are assured of the United States defending them with the China defense. But the main problem is going to be this capability deficiency. I would also think that there's a question about the no-fly zone. I think the West is already giving, or the US is already giving, the Stinger missile, which, by the way, defeated the Soviet Union in Afghanistan. Now, I don't know whether the aircraft that the Russians have developed have a capacity to deflect that. But if a massive induction of Stinger missiles, and there are quite a few capabilities coming from Israel, that can really determine some of the battlefield outcomes. My worry, though, the Russians won't stop there. They will engage in massive artillery bombardment. They don't need aircraft for doing that. They have already got enough artillery to destroy Kyiv and other cities. And this is going to hurt the people living there, even though they are very, very brave at this point. So I don't know whether no-fly zone declaration is actually will not work. In fact, it will not be credible. But this indirect way to establish that may be the way to go.
Kerry, do you want to come in on the question on any of these questions, but particularly the one about NATO membership as sufficient to deter?
Yeah. No, I think this was never really about NATO membership. So I think that right now, I don't know what the out is. I don't think the time for an off-ramp, I don't think it's the time for an off-ramp. President Putin has put his hand into a mangle right now. And I don't think it's the time to offer an off-ramp. And I don't think that the off-ramp saying, okay, Ukraine will be neutral, Ukraine will never join NATO. I don't think from a principle perspective it's right, but of course that's NATO, that's Ukraine's choice. But I don't think it would do it. If indeed his aim is to either stop the democratization of Ukraine or stop Ukrainian nationalism, greater Russia, etc., that wouldn't do it. So, and then, roll back history. If Ukraine had been allowed to join 2008, 2009, and following that, would this be happening? I don't think we can say no. Because right now what NATO is doing and needs to do is prepare for very high risk of territorial incursions in places like the Baltics. So I don't think it's about it. I don't think that would have prevented it. I do think that Ukraine has come very, very far along the path. It wasn't there in 2008, but it's come really far along the path to NATO membership. I'm thrilled to see what's happened in the EU. So depending what happens next, I certainly wouldn't discount a much more open discussion at NATO about membership later. But it depends what happens with Russia, right?
Great, thank you. Timofiy, two questions for you that have come through from the chat. The first from Mikhail, I hope I have that pronounced correctly, asking, do Ukrainians still express hope about the West expanding its help through financial support, through sanctions, weapons? Are they still talking about that as the first question? And then a question around whether Russia could ever establish a stable governance structure in Ukraine, particularly given the demographics of the population. The younger population having never experienced Soviet times. So what's your sense of that possibility? I could also squeeze in a third for you if there's time, and that's just from one of our graduate students about if there's anything concrete that students in North America, that North Americans can do to aid in Ukraine's struggle.
Okay, thank you. So I'll try to answer all four real quick. Fourth is mine. I just wanted to say on NATO. NATO, I think, is a red herring. Ukraine was not trying to join NATO and was not on the plate as an offer. And even now, there's nothing in rhetoric of Zelensky to suggest that he's asking for NATO, he's asking for the EU. How things will work out in the end, that's an open question. There's overwhelming support currently, obviously, for joining NATO, but I don't think the offer is there. On the sanctions support, financial and military, Ukrainians are frustrated that Ukraine has not received that support before. Had Ukraine been a stronger economy and better prepared military, and we had Stingers and Javelins and others shipped to us not after the war started, but way before, so that we could distribute them and get trained, probably the situation would have been very different, and Russia would have been stopped right at the borders. But there is a major package being put up right now from support of Ukraine. I'm pretty sure there will be a major post-war recovery effort.
Yeah.
Now, on the stability of any kind of occupational government, I don't think it's even feasible. It's Ukraine. It's 40 million people, and about 20% or 10% of them are willing to fight. So you have to run major concentration camps or military camps or prison camps or something like that too. That's gonna be really, really costly. Russia is only 130, 140 million people. Ukraine it's too big. It's not a couple of million people. It's really big. They've decided to take at least half of the country. That's just miscalculation. Had they taken a town, maybe then would have been possible. On what can be done, just speak up, think of this, especially as students, you're not yet thankfully so analytical and that you're thinking in models and strategy. It's about human life. We ignore many other countries. Ukraine is in some senses lucky that Ukraine is on the border with the EU. I remember 2014 where our protesters were being shot in the Maidan Square, in the central square of Kiev, and Venezuelan students were being shot by their police. And we were in New York Times, and Venezuelan students were not, because people didn't care enough. So, if you care enough about us, we have a better chance of surviving. And I think that's it.
I'm glad you addressed that last point. One of our students asked the question about, the selective attention to resistance and struggles, and that Ukraine in some ways has been in the spotlight in a particular way. There's also a question from a couple of students, Kerry, about, or anyone who would like to come in, about the really troubling scenes we have seen of discrimination of people of color, of non-Ukrainian nationals trying to leave the country. And in preparation for that General Assembly vote, I was reading a number of commentaries about, what is it that the General Assembly could do beyond symbolism. And I read some commentary that had indicated one of the things it could have done was call explicitly on member states and for UN agencies and actors to ensure the safe passage of foreign nationals out of the country and to not discriminate. That wasn't, from what I could see, featuring in the resolution we saw yesterday. But I wonder what your views are on that particular issue. But if others want to come in, please do.
So it's a particular issue right now of some of the receiving states apparently treating refugees crossing the border in a way that is discriminatory. But I think it could turn very quickly into a broader issue of neighboring states not necessarily keeping their borders open as much as they need to. Europe has seen refugee inflows as a destabilizing factor. And that hasn't really stopped. And so in a way, what you're seeing, the racism on the border is, remnants of that, and that is still there. What can be done about that? Well, first off, my understanding, my hope is that there's discussions about a humanitarian corridor. It's absolutely urgently needed. Those are dangerous and they're difficult. Sometimes they create targets, so they have to be negotiated with the Russians. So who knows, but that's really, really important. Second thing is it's a bit ad hoc right now. So there's a lot of good welcome on the borders, but UNHCR and EU have to get more engaged, and they can help blunt some of the horrible stuff that has been happening on the border. But I think it's also important for states like Canada and other states to not only just say, okay, we'll take a lot more, and there's a lot of work to be done inside Canada to do that better, but also to work with those states to make sure they keep their borders open. We have a lot of lessons on how you can integrate refugees, family sponsorship, that kind of thing. We should be a little more, I think, activist in reaching out to Europe to nudge, push, help, assist in that direction so that the borders stay open and stay open in a fair way. So I think, well, you know, I hope that the refugee outflows don't go where we think they'll go, but it could be, you know, more than 5 million people in very short order. So the world's not quite ready on that front.
Thank you. I don't know, TV, there was a couple of questions as well in the chat about the risk of nuclear escalation. I don't know if you want to say something about that in particular. It's also been very interesting to see, and Timofiy may have views on this as well, about the priority within the Russian operation to surround nuclear facilities in Ukraine, obviously nuclear power facilities. But that's been a striking aspect of what they've done on the ground.
I don't see Russia using nuclear weapons in Ukraine. That's a question that was noticed. But it could do what you call a demonstration test if it feels the West is pushing too hard. Now, that doesn't really mean they will go suicidal. It's mutual assured destruction is mutual suicide in many ways. But there's going to be quite a bit of posturing if Russia is put into a corner. That's very critical here. Right now, they're not in a corner yet. I mean, of course, if we believe the resistance succeeds, maybe there is more chance of that happening. But where my worry is the Baltic states. If he expands this conflict to the Baltic in some fashion, that may generate heightened nuclear alert. And NATO's doctrines say that an attack on any member state is an attack on all. The Article 5 will kick in. And that would mean nuclear first use. You know, so there's all those possibilities. But I think the taboo still operates even for the Russians. And they have been a supporter of the taboo, by the way, the last 70 years odd. There was one question about Taiwan, which I think is definitely worth answering. I think Xi Jinping is a much more strategic in his activities. He has this Belt and Road Initiative, but at the same time, his is a salami tactics. In other words, the Russians are into this Clausewitzian, go and completely destroy your opponent, where the Chinese are slowly cut your enemy to, you know, wherever you can. So I don't see a direct invasion anytime soon, but other forms of activities, increased activities could be happening. Unless, of course, they perceive the West or United States is completely weakened, which I don't think so. So in the short run, no Taiwanese invasion from my perspective, but once again, international politics is often very difficult to predict. I think finally, I want to say that, by the way, Canadian Red Cross doubles the money. The Canadian government will match the money if you donate through Canadian Red Cross. I don't know what they're doing with it, but I think I just did that. And it's one way to support if you have some financial possibilities.
All right. If I can add on the nuclear stations. So what we have seen, and I've got a report from someone from the MIT, I'm not going to disclose, but it's a nuclear non-proliferation faculty member. Kind of that's the expertise, and we're working at the Kyiv School of Economics. We're operational, our analytics departments, and we're working for the government now. There have been reports of the Chernobyl station, so there are monitors, radiation monitors. They spiked several days ago, about 1,000 times up, and then very quickly they came down. The only plausible explanation I've been told by the scientist is that the storage facility was opened and closed simultaneously in multiple directions at the multiple entries. You know, they have a theory what was done, so that's potentially it was mined or something was planted there or something else. Otherwise, what would be the reason to open it up? Ukraine has 5 nuclear stations and 15 reactors, and it's true that the troops are targeting them. And so if Russia can put mines around nuclear stations, the calculus will be very, very different. So that's why, this is a real issue. On the nations, I think it's great doubling, but I also ask you to consider
Yes.
institutions which are domestic in Ukraine. Why? Because they are much more efficient. They have zero overheads. We all are working without salaries. We all, half of us are Western trained, and we are shipping it exactly where it's needed. For example, we're working directly with the state emergency services, territorial defense, paramedics, fire brigades, national command. And so we know exactly what they need, what specifications they need, and we can deliver them overnight through the channels, which some of them are gray, meaning that they are fast and will get there. And Red Cross sometimes, or some other organizations, they have to do it proper. It has to be insured. So, a dollar can go further sometimes if you go to a right domestic organization. But you have to be careful about what the cause is and where it's done or something like that. But we raised, just us, Kyiv School of Economics, we raised over $3 million over the last 36 hours for humanitarian relief. Again, just check carefully which organizations, but I would still try to use domestic ones.
Yeah.
Thank you very much. We're a couple of minutes over time. And as much as it would be fantastic to stay, I know it's late for Timofiy. And we don't want to keep you too long on an evening where you have so much else to think about. And I want to thank very much all of our speakers for sharing their thoughts today. There was a couple of questions we didn't get to, and I'm sorry about that. And I also want to just take note that PPAGS, our student organization at Max Bell, will circulate the links to the Red Cross and to the Kyiv School of Economics, should anyone wish to use those links. I know we will all keep a close watch on developments. Our thoughts are with the civilian population in particular in Ukraine, that from all accounts is in for some very difficult days. And I hope that we can convene again to discuss in better circumstances than we are right now. Thank you for joining, all of you. Thank you to TV and to Kerry and to Timofiy. And we'll sign off for now.
Thanks a lot.
Thank you. Thank you so much.